Policy updates. The Student Promotions Committee and the Committee on Curriculum and Educational Policy, or CCEP, have been working a lot recently to review and update some policies in the college. So here's what's new regarding educational policies. First is the Academic Standing and Dismissal policy. This was reviewed and updated by the Student Promotions Committee. This used to be a single policy that covered all 4 years, with a separate policy looking at some specific things that happened in senior year. And the committee decided just to split this into 2 separate policies, one for the preclinical years and one for the clinical year. These have been reviewed by the Office of General Counsel to make sure they're fair and equitable and that we're meeting all external requirements as well. So the clinical year policy now incorporates what used to be a separate policy demonstrating the student's requirement to show that they have the 9 entry-level competencies that are described by our accreditor, the AVMA Council on Education. So this is not a new requirement, it's just changing where it's placed, and instead of having it as a separate policy, it's now part of the clinical year academic standing and dismissal policy. The other change made for the policy specific for clinical year is about the number of pass with reservation grades that students can get. So now that we have changed to pass-fail grading, the policy needs to reflect what the different grades are going to mean to the student, and it had to be clarified how many pass with reservations they can get, what sort of activity that triggers at the Academic and Student Affairs Office, what it means for the faculty member when a student is given that grade, and more specifically what it means for the student. What will the consequences be for them? And so that has now been clarified in this policy. The preclinical year policy really only had one big change, and that was a change in the minimum GPA requirement before a student was on academic probation or even academic suspension. The policy was written at a time that our courses were graded AF, and now the vast majority of courses, especially in the first year, are graded pass-fail, and that changes how the GPA is calculated. So we were finding a large number of students going on to academic probation or suspension when it was really just a math error, if you will. It was not a reflection of whether or not they were struggling in the curriculum. So this change was made to ensure that when this is triggered, when we see students with a certain GPA, it really is identifying students who are struggling and not just identifying an unexpected change due to our change in grading paradigm used in first year. The other policies were reviewed by the CCEP, or Curriculum Committee, and these were policies that were put in place during the pandemic, and some of them, while perfectly appropriate during the pandemic, may not be how we want to continue to manage things long term. So these were discussed at the fall and spring course coordinators meeting, and their input solicited, and then the Curriculum Committee broke into 4 subcommittees to look at 4 specific big questions that arose from this review, so we can think about changing these policies now that the COVID pandemic has ebbed. We have a new central policy that requires us to schedule our academic years much farther ahead of time than we used to. And that means when we change educational policies, oftentimes we cannot immediately enact those policies. And so as we go through these, I'll describe which ones could happen this year, which ones will happen this year, which ones will not be able to happen until later on. For example, next year, the 2025-2026 academic year. So the first thing that was discussed is hybrid teaching, and there is a whole separate teaching tip about hybrid teaching and about best practices in hybrid teaching. But what we're talking about here is when you are in the classroom, you have students in the room in front of you, you are also on Zoom, you have students in that population as well, and so you're trying to manage both of those populations. This, as we've all discovered, and as is evident in the literature, is extremely difficult to do well. It's very difficult to really pretend that you're managing those 2 separate populations of students with equal attention. We certainly value having that flexibility for ourselves and for the students of having Zoom available. Zoom is a mechanism for us to record and archive those lectures, and that's of great value to the students as well. So we want to allow for that possibility to exist. We want to continue to archive those lectures, to tape those lectures. And so what CCEP has considered and what will be enacted this fall is that we will not change the fact that you are both talking to the students and you're on Zoom, but the default in Zoom is that chat will be shut down. And that's because having chat open is a lot of what causes the pressure on the faculty, that they feel like they need to be reading it. Students will often use it for non-class related things, which just pulls your attention away as a teacher while you're reading things that aren't really adding to the discussion or describing for you where they're confused. The chat gets to be the biggest problem. So what will be instituted this fall, the fall of 2024, is that the chat will automatically be off for a meeting. That doesn't mean you can't open the chat if you want to. So this is what it looks like. If you go into the chat, you can tell it who you want to talk to in chat. And if you want to change the default, which is that no one can chat, and change it to everyone can chat, you can do that. So if chat is something that you regularly use to engage students in that other audience, you are very welcome to do that if you wish. So you may opt in. It's just that the default is going to be that there will be no chat. And if you want help opting in, there's always a classroom tech helper in the room who can help you with that. The next question that was discussed was examination windows. So during COVID, we went to all online examinations with fairly long examination windows. And that has become a burden for some faculty who feel like they have to have sort of a heightened presence during that whole open window, which might include weekends. It's also a burden for some students as they look at their schedule and just appear to see exams happening at all times. So looking at when students actually take the exams, it's pretty clear that they usually either take it right when it opens or just before it closes, somewhere within that last 2 days before it closes. So the decision that was considered by CCEP is, do they really need to be open longer than 2 days? And the decision was made that there should be a minimum time for the exams to be open of 48 hours, those being working days, so weekdays, with, again, ability for you to jiggle that around if you want. And the sorts of things we're thinking about here is that maybe you do want it over a weekend and you're fine checking it over the weekend. You can do that as long as it's open at least 2 days during the week as well. Maybe you have a class where you have a bunch of quizzes and they take a quiz once a week and it's always open to them and they just have to hand one in every Sunday. If you have some sort of example like that, that's fine too. Mainly we're just looking at those that are big scheduled quizzes or exams that need to be on the schedule. Because they need to be scheduled and our schedule is already set for the current academic year, this would not be instituted until the fall of 2025. Related to that was a question about whether or not we should allow in-person examinations again instead of all exams being online. And there have been concerns raised that taking an in-person exam requires a skill set beyond content knowledge. It's being in a room with a lot of people. It's not being able to have materials with you. It's not being able to stand up and walk around when you like. All of those things that might be stressors for people taking exams that they sort of need to practice, especially before they take a high stakes exam that will be proctored and will be in that sort of a space, like the North American Veterinary Licensing Exam, or NAVLE. The other concern is that with online exams, students just may be more tempted to cheat since there is just automatically less oversight of them. The main problem about offering all of our exams as in-person exams is that we just don't have time in the schedule for it. Right now, our students are so tightly scheduled that there literally are not enough hours in the day for us to be able to plug in a bunch of 2-hour slots for examinations. And some courses just really benefit from having online exams. They're built in a way where online exams make more sense. So at this point, we believe as a committee, the curriculum committee, that there is value in having some in-person exams, especially for those examinations that are more similar to the NAVLE, that they're more high stakes. It's a cumulative final exam, or it's an examination that's worth a significant percentage of the points. If you want to offer your exams in person instead of online, again, that cannot happen during this coming academic year, which is already scheduled, but we could consider it for the 2025-2026 academic year. You all get sent information from the scheduler when scheduling starts, and that would be one of the things you would have to include in your request for scheduling to make sure you could be considered for that. Recognizing that if too many of us ask for it, there is going to have to be some decision made about which ones are actually made as in-person exams. And again, that's just due to time. The last thing that was discussed was the idea of more broadly how much should be in person and how much should be virtual. How much of an education in a curriculum should be in person versus virtual. And again, there's a whole nother teaching tip where I talk about it, but sort of the brief review for you is that the member of the curriculum committee who was responsible for this question and the student who was working with him and myself, we all did literature reviews, and we found out there's really nothing in the literature that specifically says this is what percentage of a curriculum or a program should be hands-on in person versus being virtual. There are some problems with virtual learning. Some people do not learn well with virtual learning, and there are some studies that show that they demonstrate that by not doing as well on test scores. On the other hand, there are some that show that as long as it's a high quality course, a high quality virtual offering, the students can learn just fine. The bigger piece, I think, of concern is the social piece, and our students actually talked to us about this quite a bit during COVID when they only got to see their lab group. They never really got to know the rest of their class as well as previous classes had. There is a big social component of learning, not just helping you learn the material, but helping you learn to work in groups and helping you work with groups with people in them you wouldn't ordinarily spend time with, and all of these other skills that we all use every day as working veterinarians. So I think what we want to consider is that there is value in the flexibility of virtual work. There is certainly great value in the hands-on and in-person training that we do. And we really do want to think about that social piece. If any group is going to have a particularly large amount of virtual work, we need to build in ways for them to build community with each other and with their instructors. If you have any questions about any of these, please watch for the associated teaching tips that are there, or send your questions to the CVM Education Support Group at cvmces@umn.edu.